wrestling fans, finally, after 2 years of research, going through archives, talking with members of the Gagne family and pro wrestling historian George Schire, and also reaching out to the University of Minnesota for their archives, I have finally finished and have published the biography of the 10-time AWA World Heavyweight Champion and co-founder of the AWA, the American Wrestling Association, Verne Gagne. This man was the first 4-time Big Nine wrestling champion in college wrestling history. First ever to do it in the 40s. He went on to play for a brief stint with the Green Bay Packers, Chicago Bears, but his love was in professional wrestling. And this book covers it. Covers from his time when his family came from France over to Canada and eventually into Corcoran, Minnesota. Talks about his parents. It talks about how he met his wife and raising his 4 children. Getting into the wrestling business, his later years in life of what he did. And folks, it's a great book. I encourage you to purchase it today. If you buy it on hardback, it's $19.99 at Amazon, Lulu, Barnes & Noble, and Robu Rakuten. I tell you, folks, it's a great book. I know I'm being biased, but it really is. I put a lot of effort into it. I ask you, if you want the digital version, it's only $7.99. So go to those sites, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Lulu, Kobo Rakuten. Get on there today and get one just in time for a Christmas present for that wrestling fan or for people that just like to read. Folks, let me know how you like the book. Write a review at the bottom when you're done with it. If you don't like it, let me know. Tell me what I did wrong. Tell me what I missed. Tell me what I could work better on. If you liked it, let me know that too. I'd love to hear your feelings on it. Get out there and get one today. $19.99 for the hard copy, $7.99 for the digital. Happy holidays from my family to yours, and enjoy the book, folks. It's a really good one. Thank you, and have a Welcome to another edition of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. I'm Brian Ferguson. Folks, today we got the world's most dangerous pro wrestling historian on again, and we're going to talk about something pretty awesome today. My good friend, George Schire. George, welcome back.
Hey, it's always good to be with you, sir. Good morning.
Good morning. All right, so today we have decided we want to talk about the territory known as the Mid-South. And George, I know you have a lot of insight on this and would love to hear how it got started and how it grew. So give us a little bit of input on that, please.
Well, I don't know. I don't know, Brian, if it's so much insight as it is just kind of some facts that go along the way. And if you kind of keep them in chronological order, which for some odd reason my brain can do. Not that I don't take a detour once in a while, but nonetheless, the Mid-South, when we say that, I think we have to kind of define the territory because I have heard over the years that, people say South, they right away think of, Texas and Florida and Alabama and Memphis and so on and so forth. Well, in this case, we are talking the Louisiana, Oklahoma territory, and that's Mid-South. And if you look at your United States map, you can see that they're just kind of right above Texas and right around the bottom of the map there. So what was interesting, and we know about the territory days. There were thriving territories all across the country. We always know the three main groups that seem to be prominent: the AWA, the NWA, the WWF in the 70s. And we know the boundaries that were kept, the handshakes that were made. We minded our own business. We didn't go into other territories. And we borrowed talent from our fellow promoters, and we shared talent from ours to them. And it just was a smooth operation. Yeah. There were promoters that could call up another promoter and say, "Hey, I need somebody up here to spark attendance. Can you send me this guy or that guy? And I'll give you this guy." Okay, great. They do it. And it worked. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the territories, and it was a smaller territory in the late 60s till 1970-ish, and that was the Oklahoma Territory, Louisiana. It was run by Leroy McGurk. Now, to some fans, they'll say, "Well, who in the heck was Leroy McGurk?" And they may never have heard from him. This is a guy that was born in 1912. So, by 1970, he was an old man. And he was running a small organization. But the thing he had to his advantage, Brian, was Oklahoma was the star territory of some great professional wrestlers, some great athletes. Oklahoma University. They produced some real talents. And if I throw names out to you, you'll go, "Wow, maybe I didn't know that." Dale Lewis. Danny Hodge, oh my gosh. Nick Bockwinkel was at Oklahoma. A lot of names that, and Oklahoma was always big in football. Oklahoma U, etc. So it was a very talented area. It had a very solid fan base, but from pro wrestling standpoint, it struggled. The real star that they had, that Leroy McGurk had, was Danny Hodge. And Danny Hodge, we should remind people, was not the biggest pro wrestler in the world by physical stature. We're talking. He was pretty much an average looking guy, but the guy was as strong as they come. And there are legendary stories talking about how he could take his grip. We're not talking a claw hold now here. We're talking he had the grip where he could squeeze and break a pliers in half. He could squeeze take a great big delicious red apple, and he'd squeeze it and just turn it right into applesauce dripping down. Try that. I challenge anybody. Grab an apple, put it in your hand, and try to squeeze it just into nothing but liquid. Danny Hodge could do it. And he went around and he'd demonstrate this to people. He was extremely strong. Plus, from Oklahoma U, he had an amateur wrestling background that was second to none. And you ask any old pro, let's just say pre-1980, that had been in the business, the one guy they respected the most was Danny Hodge. And it wasn't because he was big. Usually he was billed as a junior heavyweight from weight.
Right.
He was under 230 pounds, 220 pounds. He was usually the junior heavyweight champion as recognized by the National Wrestling Alliance, who we should point out, the NWA, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, they weren't really a promotion. They were a champion, an organization of promoters, a group of promoters that paid dues, had annual meetings, and voted on a champion, a heavyweight champion.
Yeah.
And then that champion traveled to the territories that these promoters were members of, and they could have the champion come in and defend the title. Well, Danny Hodge was their junior heavyweight champion. And Danny would also be borrowed out in the 60s. He would go to Florida and he'd come to Minnesota, on my territory. And we would recognize him as the junior heavyweight champion, never putting the NWA in front of it here in Minnesota. But he was introduced as the world junior heavyweight champion. And he had great Danny was one of those guys that most of the promoters, they just respected him, and Danny's word was good. He was trusted, respected. So when you get to Oklahoma territory, though, in the 60s, Danny was about all that was the big news in pro wrestling there, because the territory was, as Leroy McGurk was already up in the years. And I'm going to point this out because people have said this that worked with Leroy. Leroy had had the unfortunate fate to lose his eyesight in a car accident way early in the late 50s or late 40s. Yeah. So he was blind. And, you know, I myself wearing glasses and having been born with them, I came out with glasses from the birth canal, for God's sakes. True story. I mean, I was born with bad eyes. But when a person wears glasses, you're correcting your vision to the best you can. But I think to have vision, any vision, and go blind, go dark, that has to be a true handicap.
Yeah.
Leroy McGurk, and he was an excellent wrestler. He was also the world junior heavyweight champion. He was another wrestler. He could take anybody on the mat and stretch them and make them say uncle. That's the kind of guy he was. So with his loss of eyesight, tough stuff. And Leroy, from reports that I've heard from wrestlers that worked with him, around him, they said he got very bitter. He got very just mean. You know, it was tough for him. And I guess he started taking up drinking, and he probably had an alcohol problem. And so there was alcohol talking at times versus maybe who the real person was. We know how that happens. So Leroy wasn't always one of the nicest guys that a lot of wrestlers would say to be around. Mm-hmm. So he's running this territory in the 60s. And, you know, being honest, the territory was drawing some fans, but they weren't setting any records. They weren't drawing any huge talent. For a while, they had the Kentuckians, Grizzly Smith, Jake Smith, and Luke Brown, who by Oklahoma standards were huge. They were monsters.
Yeah.
And they had the Assassins, Joe Hamilton and Tom Ernesto for a while in, but that was about the big thing. That was it. And then they relied on older talent like Mike Clancy and Red McKim and Crusher Carlson and Tarzan Baxter. They had a wrestler named Chuck Carbo. But a lot of these guys, when I say their names, you go, God, I never heard them in the mainstream per se. And it just wasn't a territory that had anything to shout about, and usually didn't get any coverage in even the newsstand magazines. So let's flash forward to about the end of the 60s, and we'll start with 1970. But before I do that, I want to say that the guy that came in to really start to revitalize the Mid-South territory was a guy who had a very storied history in pro wrestling. He was a pro football player. He played football for the Houston Oilers back in the day. He played football at University of Oklahoma, as we talked about. He got into wrestling basically because in football in those days, you didn't have these lucrative, life-changing salaries that we have today. Yeah. Back in the 60s, a pro football player could make $6,000 a year being a lineman or something. And, for 1960s, that probably was a decent salary based on, the era. But we weren't talking thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And so Bill Watts, he had been, true story, this is the guy we're talking about now, Bill Watts. Mm-hmm. He had been out with his friend, Wahoo McDaniel. And Wahoo McDaniel is legendary in pro wrestling. We know this. Mm-hmm. But back in that era, Wahoo was wrestling on the off season a lot Wahoo had played for the New York Jets. He had played for, he was in Houston, I know, for a while, and he had a couple of other teams in there, but he was a pro footballer that he was just a tough son of a gun. He wasn't the biggest guy in the world, but he was tough. You didn't want to mess with Wahoo. It wasn't that he was the greatest wrestler, but he was tough. And, sometimes those guys are meaner to deal with than the guy that could stretch you and hand you your arms. So Bill Watts and Wahoo were out having some barley pops one night. And the story goes that Wahoo had taken out some money, and it was a wad of cash. And Watts made the comment to him about, where in the hell did you get that kind of money? And Wahoo said he got it wrestling. And Bill Watts was enamored with this, saying something to the effect, and I am paraphrasing here. Now, I'm not quoting exactly, okay? But Bill Watts made the comment supposedly to him that, well, hell, I can beat the crap out of you. How do I get into this business? And Bill was also, probably wrestling off season in those days.
Mm-hmm.
So he got into the business. Now, Bill Watts, by wrestling standards, was a big guy. He always went around 290, 295, 300 pounds. And it wasn't that he was fat at all. He wasn't a fat guy. He wasn't blubbery. He was a solid muscled guy, but not, muscle bound, just big. And, and he was rough. And he had the unique ability where he could be a heel, and he could be hated like you would not believe, or he could be the baby face, and you could love him like your grandpa. He was just, he had that ability to be both in a different territory or sometimes in the same. Well, his biggest venture started in 1963 when he went into the then WWWF, and Bruno Sammartino was the champion.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Ferguson. I want to tell you about a great book written by my good friend, Mr. George Schire. It's called Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, from Verne Gagne to the Road Warriors. George dives deep into the Golden Age of Wrestling, starting with the 1950s, talking about Lou Thesz, Verne Gagne, Wilbur Schneider, and many others, and goes all the way deep into the AWA and into the 1980s, ending with the tag team domination of the Road Warriors. Now, this book includes photos of George's personal collection, as well as programs and sports facts that was published for many years. So go to Amazon today or the Minnesota Historical website and get this book as soon as you can. And folks, enjoy the podcast.
And one of Bruno's constant or frequent tag team partners at that time was a guy named Cowboy Bill Watts. Again, because he was big, he was a draw, he was a good baby face. And Bruno and Watts would team together against the top heels like Killer Kowalski and Gorilla Monsoon and Waldo Von Erich and all these big villains. Well, they were smart. They had the storyline going where, Bill Watts wanted to have a chance at the championship, and somehow he wasn't going to be able to get the belt or get a title shot, it seems like, because he was working with Bruno instead of against Bruno. And I want a match with you. We don't have, we'll try to sign it. The old story. I don't know if we can, the promoters. And eventually in a tag team bout or some tag team bouts, you started to see the discord between Bruno and Watts, where Watts was getting a little aggressive. Maybe they missed a tag and eventually, out of frustration, now this is storyline, and this is what made wrestling so good over a period of time. Eventually, Watts is frustrated, and he literally just starts beating the crap out of Bruno, turns on him in a match. Man. Oh, my God, this is unheard of. What the hell is wrong with Watts? The guy's a moron. The fans hate him all of a sudden. And you can look this up. I mean, for those that care to try to find records of attendance, etc. As it was the formula back then, Bill Watts ended up having a series of matches against his former friend, his former partner, in the ring, of course. Outside, they remained friends. but in the
Right.
ring. And their matches were sellouts. Madison Square Garden, Bill Watts, his turncoat. It was such a big deal at the time, Brian, that it actually, the feud between Bruno and Watts made the story in the then very popular magazine, the Saturday Evening Post. Back in the 60s, the 70s, we had the Saturday Evening Post, Life magazine, Look magazine. These were huge newsstand publications. But they weren't wrestling publications. And
Right.
the Watts turn, the money that was made at the Garden, the storyline, how it was really over on the East Coast, made the Saturday Evening Post. And they basically painted Watts as this just evil, more evil than you can imagine bad guy. The story, I still remember the title. It was The Rich, Full Life of a Wrestling Bad Guy. And then they had this Bill Watts story. So that was the story with Bill Watts. That's how he really started to gain. He wrestled some in Canada. He wrestled some in California after that, always being a draw, being near the top. And by his own admission, he got into some legal trouble. I don't know that I've ever heard what the legal trouble was, and I don't think he cares to say, but he got into some trouble where he had to leave the country, and he did.
Oh.
So he was up in Canada or wherever, and he just kind of off the radar for a while. But he got back into the U.S., again, a big draw. He started wrestling in St. Louis, which everybody knows is a hub for just outstanding cards over the years with Sam Muchnick at the helm. And Sam brought him in as a masked wrestler called Dr. Scarlet. He had the scarlet color now. It's kind of a deep purple. That's the color scarlet. He had a deep purple mask on. He had purple tights, tunic, top, and he wore a purple, not a robe, but a cape into the ring. And he was Dr. Scarlet from Parts Unknown. And for about 8 or 10 months, which was normal formula for St. Louis, they would push this mask guy. And eventually, he's going to get a shot at the reigning NWA champion. They had a rule in the NWA, which they always said that if a masked wrestler were to get a title shot, he would have to unmask, because the NWA would not recognize an unknown person or have the fans not know who their champion is, which was kind of a different angle because most promotions didn't care if the masked guy was the champion of the territory. That added to the mystique. But in St. Louis, they did this with several masked wrestlers over the years. Watts was the latest. And this was in 1968. He had gotten a shot at then champion Gene Kiniski. And of course, the St. Louis programs, which I could show you if I had them in front of me here, they said that Watts is going to or Dr. Scarlet is going to have to unmask, win or lose, for this championship match. He has to unmask. So he unmasks, and oh my God, it's Cowboy Bill Watts. Well, he had this reputation, and Watts was huge. Gene Kiniski was a big guy at about 6'2" or 3, but Watts was 6'4", and he was this 290-pound guy. So even against massive Big Thunder Kiniski, he was huge. Well, a year before this, Bill Watts had come in 1967. He had come into the AWA, and he was working for Verne Gagne. Now, let's keep in mind that Bill Watts had worked for Roy Schire out in California. He had worked for Eddie Graham, some down in Florida, and he had worked for Sam Muchnick, of course. He had now wrestling for Verne Gagne. It was interesting because he was wrestling as Bill Watts here from 67 to the middle of 68, but when he'd go into St. Louis, he'd still be Dr. Scarlet for that. And, that's the beauty of it, too, because kayfabe, we had no way of knowing this. I mean, there was no way that who this Dr. Scarlet was. Well, Bill Watts, by his own admission, he was I think he was a guy who I admire because he was a sponge. He would go in and he could study people. He could go in and he could learn. He'd take the best from someone. And Bill Watts, I think by his own admission, would say that he could be stubborn. He could be
Yeah.
sometimes egotistical, sometimes arrogant, but he knew how to promote. And he always gave thanks to Verne Gagne and Roy Schire and Eddie Graham and even Ole Anderson, Rock Rogowski later on. He gave thanks to them because if you look at all those guys I just mentioned, they all had kind of the same. They were kind of bullheaded at times. They were stubborn. It was usually my way or the highway type guys, but they were all successful. And that's the key.
Yeah.
And the one thing I've always said about any person, if you want to gain success, number one, if you like your job, you have to want to do the best you can at it. You want to be able to offer suggestions how to make it better. You don't go in and push yourself on it, but you offer suggestions. You make yourself, and you also make yourself invaluable because they can't get rid of you because you're so important to the company. This was what Bill Watts could do. And when he was in a territory, he made the promoter want to keep him because of his drawing power. So in the AWA for 3 years, now we went from 67, we're going to go to 1970. During that time, he was almost AWA exclusively. He ended up being literally through a wrestling news popularity poll that allegedly was voted on by the fans. And I only say allegedly because I don't know if this was going to be a planned, he's the most popular wrestler or not. I don't know. But supposedly they had all these votes for all these wrestlers. And Bill Watts in 1968, early 69, was the most popular with the most votes. And there's a wrestling news magazine that actually lists everybody that got votes in the AWA.
Yeah.
And we're talking guys like Billy Red Lyons and Pampero Firpo and Verne Gagne and, Rene Goulet and Reggie Parks and the Crusher and you name it, Dick the Bruiser, all of these guys in the AWA, and supposedly Bill was the man. Well, the same thing that they used in New York, Verne Gagne for 2 years, 2.5 years, kept Bill Watts at bay by often teaming with him, choosing him as a partner when Verne had a score to settle with Harley Race and Hardboiled Haggerty and Larry Hennig and Lars Anderson. He'd get Bill Watts to be his partner. And they made a great team. And they were popular. And you had the two most popular guys in the territory drawing money. But again, they played the story out where eventually, will Watts get his turn? With all these other challengers that Verne is facing, will Watts get a chance? Will Verne give him a chance? And Verne says, well, there's a lot of challengers out there. There's a long list of challengers. And Bill Watts, he's in there somewhere. But, okay, when does it happen?
Yeah.
Well, they were very smart. In April of 1960, we had the match of the decade. Bill Watts was going to get his chance. And it was in Bloomington, Minnesota, which is where the old Metropolitan Sports Center used to be held, the building was, where our Minnesota North Stars hockey team played at the time. And it got a huge crowd. April, I think it was 19th, without looking, I think it was April 19th. But Bill Watts got his chance. Well, during the match, Bill Watts accidentally ran into the ring post, ended up being injured, bloodied. The referee, due to the blood flow, stopped the match. Verne got the win by default. Watts wasn't happy. He wasn't happy that he had to stop the match. He had Gagne on the run. That's his story. But they were so smart because they didn't have an immediate rematch. Now you got to get back in line, according to Verne. Well, this goes until June, so we had a whole 2 months where now Watts is going to get another match in Minneapolis. And they had him wrestle. And during the course of this match, some guy named Larry Hennig got his face in the thing and said he wanted to challenge the winner in the ring. And he ended up, him and Watts started going at it a little bit, and Watts Verne won the match because of disqualification, because Watts was disqualified. And Watts is again ticked off. We then go to November, another 3, almost 4 months later. Watts wants another shot. Now, the reason I tell this story about how this builds up is because when this feud is done, then the big thing happens. November, Watts has another wrong-sided decision. He's going to get another shot in December, late December of 1969 in Minneapolis. And this is his 4th time. And Verne Gagne makes it clear. This is the last time I'm wrestling this guy. I've been in the ring with him 3 times. Win or lose tonight, I'm done with the guy. While he did say, and have it in the program, that if Verne did lose, he did want his rematch stipulation. But he's not defending the title. Okay? He's not defending the title anymore after the Watts. So that puts the pressure on. The fans are excited because in these matches with Verne, though Verne never played a heel, Verne was always the subtle heel, where he'd do the little things like slapping Watts in the face and getting him frustrated. And the fans would boo that. So Watts was the popular one.
Yeah.
Well, Verne won. And the next program comes out. Bill Watts, it looks like his chances are done. And we never saw Bill Watts again for, about 2.5, 3 years. He was gone from the territory. He went to the Mid-South. He had an opportunity to buy into the promotion with Leroy McGurk. And for Bill Watts, this was going home. He was from Oklahoma. He lived in I think it's called Bixby, Oklahoma. And he wanted to go home. And he had an opportunity to do some promoting. But he's going into a territory that, as I pointed out earlier, is dull. It's not drawing well. They had small attendance figures. They had older wrestlers. I mean, the Crusher Carlson I mentioned, the Tarzan Baxter, Red McKim, Clancy, these guys were old. I mean, they were, well into their 40s. There was no young blood in the territory. Other than, let's keep Danny Hodge at the forefront. He could still put the butts in those seats. But Watts is coming home. So they have Bill Watts come in. And what he immediately does is what any new promoter wants to do. First of all, he knows the formula of how to make a territory work, because as he's admitted himself, he's worked with Schire, Gagne, Graham, Rogowski, others. He knows how to do it. And Bill Watts has the biggest ego in the ring. His ego was as big as the auditorium. He believed he was good. He believed he was the best, and that's good. He was. And the reason he was because his name on the marquee said fans are going to go see him. So what he did when he came in was he brought in some talent with him. He had been wrestling for Verne for that 3-year period. And there was a young wrestler working for Verne by the name of Buddy Smith. He was a rookie out of Canada who had actually been receiving some training from Verne, not officially trained by Verne, but getting coaching and, working with other AWA wrestlers. Just a young kid, black hair, good looking, baby face. Well, that was one of the guys that that Bill Watts kind of looked at and said, this kid's got talent. I like this kid. So he brought him in to the Mid-South, and he dubbed him Pretty Boy Buddy Roberts. Buddy Roberts. He bleached his hair blonde. He gave him the pretty boy gimmick, and he hooked him up with a guy named Jerry Brown, who was an older wrestler at that point. Jerry Brown was one of those older guys in the promotion like the others I had mentioned. He was a veteran. He was a good worker, but he was up in the years. So they bleached his hair blonde. Well, actually, Brown had been working with a guy named Jack Donovan in a tag team there. And the storyline went that Donovan broke his ankle, and Brown was going to have to look for a new partner. Behind the scenes, I've heard the story that Bill Watts just got rid of Donovan for personal reasons between them. I don't know what the deal was, but his ankle was broken. So he brings in Buddy Roberts, and he dubbed them the Hollywood Blondes. So now you've got this strutting, cocky, arrogant, blonde tag team. And then Bill brought in a guy that he figured he had some matches with in the past. He figured was a good draw, and he was a guy named Don Jardine. But he brought Jardine in under his masked persona of the Spoiler. And the Spoiler was known in Texas. He was known out in the East Coast. He was known in California. And Jardine had carved out quite a reputation as the Spoiler. So he brought him in as his top heel. And the North American title was put on the Spoiler pretty much upon arriving. And now you got this guy that you got to have somebody beat him. You got to have somebody take this guy down. And that's where Bill Watts came in. Now, Bill, as Verne Gagne did and other promoter wrestlers, he put himself in the limelight, reason being he knew he could draw. And what better way than to take the title from the Spoiler and become the North American champion? And he did that. So now the territory is starting to really hum. What he does then is he brings in Dutch Savage, who Bill had worked with previously in the AWA and a little bit in the Pacific Northwest. And Dutch was a veteran at that time period. And Dutch was a huge heel in Oklahoma. And Bill Watts brought him in to work with him. He also brought in Billy Red Lyons, who left the AWA at the same time Bill Watts did in 1969. But Billy left with no announcement. He was just reported to possibly be injured in the AWA. And he shows up down in Mid-South. So Bill had this core of wrestlers: Lyons, Savage, Roberts, Brown, the Spoiler. That was a good core. Then he started having the matches with Savage, which were drawing huge. As soon as those matches were done, and it was only a few months, maybe 3, could have been about 3 to I think 6 months or so, he had Savage would leave. He was just in basically helping Watts out, get this territory on fire. But they also did something else different. Bill Watts also brought in one of his buddies from the AWA and a guy that was known to the Mid-South previously, Big Luke Brown of the Kentuckians.
Oh, okay.
Now, what Bill Watts did, though, to draw heat, was he had Dutch Savage brag that he was taking Big Luke as his partner, Big Luke Brown, and he had turned him into a heel, a ruthless heel. And they had Luke Brown grow the beard similar to what Savage had. They had the same look. And, Savage was now hated because he turned this great babyface wrestler into a heel. Well, then a short time later, they had them break up. And then Brown was going to get revenge. So what did he eventually do? He brought in Grizzly Smith. The Kentuckians were back together.
Yes.
And then Bill Watts called upon his buddy Waldo Von Erich to come in, who he had worked with previously. And Waldo was doing the stereotypical German gimmick, and in 1970, we could still pull that off. If he was German, you hated him. And, he was evil to the core. And Watts and Von Erich put on some dandy matches. Oh, man. And then Von Erich brought in, Watts brought him in, but Von Erich brought in his German tag team partner, Karl von Bronner. So here you have the 1970, early 71 now. And when he came in, I show this. This was the very first program that Bill Watts had in Mid-South when he came there, and they advertised Dutch Savage being the top heel at the time. But issue number 1, or actually they call it 1970 number A. I guess they would decided to go alphabetical instead of numerical, number A. I never knew A's or alphabet was numbers, but it was talking about. I didn't either. It was talking about the new era, and they had Gary Hart in as a manager for the Spoiler. Dutch Savage has corrupted Luke Brown, made big stories. Wow. You can see how Luke is looking clean shaven there.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have the second one I pulled out here. They're putting Hodge over. They're putting Bill Watts over as most popular. They had another good draw, Klondike Bill, who kind of teamed with Luke Brown once in a while.
Wow. It's pretty awesome.
Luke and Dutch were the tag team champions, the United States tag team champions. So Bill Watts had really just started to put this territory on fire. It was getting noticed.
Yeah.
And he continued to bring in constant talent. He eventually had Sir Oliver Humperdinck as the Blondes manager. And, you know, as we look through the years, he had Billy Red Lyons as his tag team partner. They became tag team champions, him and Watts. So the territory was really doing well because of this new influx at a new territory for a lot of wrestlers to make a stopover in. And he used guys over the years like Billy Robinson and Ken Patera. He had Larry Hennig come in. He had Rene Goulet come through. And in doing this, Mid-South became one of those territories that the magazines, the Out East magazines, would now have a feature on occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it started from Mid-South. So with that, let me ask you if you have any questions before we move on.
I was just going to ask you, you know, Bill Watts, you know, was a fantastic wrestler, promoter. Why do you think he was never, I mean, he was big enough. He had the draw power. Why do you ever think he was not become the NWA or world champion?
I think that the most logical answer, and I'm going to say I'm speculating here, but number one, you know, the NWA board, all of the member promoters that would have their annual meetings and they would vote on who their champion was going to be. There was always a lot of names tossed out. There were always promoters that wanted to push so-and-so and try to get the backing, you know, with his fellow promoters to get so-and-so to be the champion. But around this time, you got to remember in 1970, Dory Funk Jr. was the NWA champion. And the NWA was doing good box office with Dory. And Dory was a solid worker in the vein that the NWA wanted as a champion in those days. They wanted a wrestler first, a gimmick second, and usually more wrestler than anything. They tried to shy away from the gimmicks, okay? And then you had the interim deal with Harley Race, and Jack Briscoe became the person that most were, and he was from Oklahoma. But Eddie Graham was touting Jack Briscoe. And so why Watts didn't get it, that's probably one of the reasons, is that there were just a couple of other guys that at the first 3 or 4 years of Mid-South had a little more clout, a little more backing. Yeah. The other side of it is, and I love Bill Watts to pieces. I tell you what, he was at one point when I was a kid, he was my favorite wrestler. I love him as a person today. I know he's got his detractors, guys that didn't like working for him, guys that thought he was a bully, you know, but Bill Watts promoted like those other promoters I'd mentioned earlier. And when you're successful, Brian, how can you knock it when what you're doing is working? And that's what Bill Watts was. And Bill Watts could be very stubborn. He'd set rules up for in the Mid-South. He would set up rules for guys that if you're late to the card, you're fined. I'm going to deduct your pay, etc. And you know, a lot of guys, you know, like, what the hell's the matter with this guy? You know, but you know what? He's the boss. He was running a company. He expected you to be responsible, and he wanted your loyalty. And usually when you were loyal to Bill, Bill was loyal to you. It was a give and take. And if you weren't loyal to him, I think Bill was the kind of a guy where he'd run over you. He'd just, you know, go away. I don't have any time for you. So why he didn't probably a lot because of that type of attitude. And at the same time, the other guys that I mentioned, Dory Jr. and Briscoe. Then, Terry Funk got into the mix. There was just other, and of course, Harley started to become the man. And it was all about who they were going to be able to draw nationally with the most,
right,
for the longest period of time. And with Bill being the promoter at this point now in the NWA or part of the NWA, because Dory would come into Mid-South and defend the title once or twice a year. Being that he was the promoter, Bill wasn't going to be able to go and travel around the United States 300 days a year as the NWA or more as the NWA champion had to do, and also make the trip to Japan and Australia, etc. So I think that's the reason I'd give. But Bill Watts himself, if there was any other hidden agendas, he'd be the guy to ask. And sadly, Bill isn't able to do that anymore. He's dealt with health problems, and I think he's about 85 years old. I think he's 85 right now, and so yeah, we probably never get his total perspective. I tell you this though, fans out there that want to learn about Bill Watts and some of these stories about Mid-South and the other promotions and some of his background, grab his book, where the title is escaping me. Something and the Cross. The Cowboy and the Cross.
Type in. Okay, I was just going to say, type in Bill Watts on Amazon. It'll come up.
Yeah, type in Bill Watts, Cowboy Bill Watts. I think it's The Cowboy and the Cross. That's the name of the book. It's an outstanding book. It's one of my favorites of all of the wrestler books. Now, I will tell you about that much of the end of the book. It's a fairly thick book, but about that much of the end of it, Bill Watts, he found the Lord later on. He found religion. He's born again. He can preach, and I have nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's cool. But he does get into the end with some of his own philosophies and theories. And I've heard some people say, I want to listen to Bill Watts talk about religion. Well, the book itself is just a phenomenal, and that's a word Bill Watts uses all the time, phenomenal. So that's why I just did it.
Yeah.
He'll tell you so-and-so wrestler was phenomenal. But the book, his book, is phenomenal. Look it up. If it's available, buy it. You won't be sorry. It's a good book.
Yeah. One more thing, and then we'll let you go. But, Mid-South in the early 80s, into the mid-80s, actually, when it actually transitioned into the UWF, not the Herb Abrams UWF. Bill Watts had Universal Wrestling Federation first. But I remember I was probably about, 14 years old. This is 84. And it started coming on television up in where we're from there, Minnesota, Wisconsin. I would see it on Channel 4, WCCO. And you would see these guys, and I was just in awe because I was just used to watching, AWA, and then, WWF would come on. But I started watching this UWF, and all these guys, Dr. Death Steve Williams, Terry Bam Bam Gordy was the first champion, One Man Gang, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, all these guys that were pre-WWF were here. Ted DiBiase. It was just a nucleus of who's who. And Bill Watts, you can elaborate, had that kind of, I guess, ability to get these guys in here because they could draw. Hey everyone, this is Brian Ferguson, the host of Bumps and Thumps, the Talk of Wrestling. I want to tell you about a good friend of mine's book, Joyce Postion. Her book, My Ringside Seat to the AWA, gives a close look at all the events she attended in the AWA from the mid-70s through the 80s. Joyce has taken thousands of pictures that you won't see anywhere else and tells stories about her times with Bobby Heenan, Nick Bockwinkel, Sergeant Slaughter, and many others. Also, the foreword of the book is written by Sergeant Slaughter. So go to www.joycepostion.com and get your book today.
You know, the one thing that we kind of just touched on how it with the Mid-South was formed in the first place, but I think what you want to do, Brian, is as you go through the 70s, you get into 75, 76, 79, 80, 81, 82, you follow the timeline. And as you mentioned, it became a territory that was as big a part of the country, all of the cities that they ran in.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Bill Watts became a powerful promoter. He actually went to Atlanta for a while and was the booker in Atlanta
It was
in 1974 and had some championship runs out there. He was in Florida working for Eddie Graham. But in the Mid-South, when you look at the nucleus of the stars that he created along his timeline, we started out with these older wrestlers in the beginning. But when you look at, he created Ernie Ladd to be the huge heel he was. Ernie Ladd, former football player with the San Diego Chargers and the Kansas City Chiefs. In wrestling, Ernie was as good could get. 6 foot, million tall, a heel personified, big. Awesome on the mic. I hated his guts. But Bill Watts knew how to use, and Bill will tell you in his book, he'll tell you about the black athlete. Now, there are stories that Bill Watts was a racist and that Bill Watts was a bigot. And, you know, you hear these stories, but Bill Watts had some strong opinions, whether you agree or disagree, but he knew how to use wrestlers. And let's not forget that he took a guy by the name of Sylvester Ritter and brought him in and dubbed him the Junkyard Dog. JYD. And, you know, and one of my favorite angles when I think of JYD, how, you know, wrestling was always, you go with the times, you go with the trends, you go with a theme that's happening in the news. Well, back in the later 70s, there was a song by, I think it's Jim Croce, and it was called Bad Bad Leroy Brown.
Yeah.
Okay? And that he was meaner than a junkyard dog.
Junkyard dog.
Okay. Bill Watts, he had JYD in his territory, who was over the top popular.
Huge.
Now let's remember too, the Mid-South had a huge black population, and they had a hero. And what does he do? He has him feud with a wrestler who named himself Bad Bad Leroy Brown, Big Bad Leroy Brown. And we had it on in the ring, the JYD Leroy Brown feud. And so JYD was huge. And you mentioned DiBiase. You look at the starting point of where Ted DiBiase, who was a babyface there, he also became part of I think they called it the Rat Pack. He was with a group of wrestlers like Duggan, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, who was another star that was making it huge. Paul Orndorff got his start from Bill Watts, who was really starting to come into prominence. And let's not forget that in 1974, 75, 76 era, Bill Watts had two guys that were working for him, a lot of times on undercards, and he had them as a team. A guy by the name of Stan Hansen and Frank Goodish. And Bill Watts, and we know Frank Goodish later became Bruiser Brody, King Kong Brody. But Bill Watts was the one, and he'll tell you this, and it's fact. They got their start as a combo in Oklahoma, Mid-South. And Bill Watts actually broke them up as a team. His logic is they were so good individually that putting them as a team, we could do more for them individually and let them grow. And we know what both of those guys did. Goodish, of course, had a legendary career, and we know Stan Hansen did. And then you go through this timeline and you realize that now it's the Universal Wrestling Federation, and Bill Watts is. But let's not forget the oil crisis in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. The South, Mid-South was the devastated by this.
Yeah.
But Bill Watts was bringing in guys like Dusty Rhodes and Dick Murdoch, getting Andre the Giant borrowed from him from Vince McMahon Sr. at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he had Killer Carl Cox. He had so many huge names that were just making Mid-South the place where wrestlers wanted to go to. He was holding, in the early 80s, he was holding these Louisiana Superdome extravaganzas and selling out the Superdome with 20,000 plus people. So that's how his timeline went. And then you realize that when 84 come along, and we know that Vince McMahon Jr. started to shoot at various territories, taking their top talents. Well, you know, he took Hogan from the AWA. He took Jesse Ventura. He took our announcer, Gene Okerlund. He even took Mad Dog Vachon and Jim Brunzell. But the bottom line is then he has to go to Mid-South. And what did he do? He took JYD. That was Bill's Hulk Hogan. That's how huge JYD was. He was every bit the Hulk Hogan of that territory. And huge at the gate. And then he took the Freebirds from him, because Bill had the Freebirds there. He had Terry Gordy and Steve Williams working together, Dr. Death. And he took Ted DiBiase, McMahon did. So you got this breakdown. And eventually, as we know happens, the Mid-South, you know, the story is complicated. We could spend 3 hours. But the bottom line is that eventually all of the talent that was there was now working for Vince McMahon. And in the end, the Mid-South Universal Wrestling Federation, then it was sold. Bill finally got out, sold to
Crockett.
It was Crockett. I was going to say Barnett, and I knew that wasn't right. Jim Crockett ended up, you know, and we get into the whole new generation of what's happening there. But Bill Watts in the wrestling business, and I say this with the utmost respect, I think if I were to name the great promoters of the kayfabe era, I'm going to put Bill Watts in the top 5.
Oh, yeah.
Anytime. And you can flip him to number 1. He had a mind for this business. And because of that, he had a lot of detractors. But he was money. He was you know, and that's how good it was. So when I look back at the territory days, boy, I tell you what, there was a who's who of talent that went through Mid-South. And we weren't talking lesser names now. We're talking main event stuff, kids. And Bill had them all. And when you look at the great territories of the 70s into the mid 80s, few were better.
Yeah, no doubt. All right. We're going to wrap it up, my friend. Pro wrestling's most dangerous historian,
brother
George Schire. Thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it. Always a pleasure to have you on, my friend.
I like to talk wrestling, if you haven't figured that out.
That's why you're on here. That's why you're a frequent guest, and I appreciate it so much. One more time, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. George Schire. Really appreciate you coming on and perspective on Mid-South. So thanks again. Appreciate it.
Let's say happy holidays, too, because this might be the last time you and I are together, and we're at the Christmas season.
It is. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.
Same to you.
And to all the fans out there that are watching or listening, happy holidays to you. And thanks for listening. If you're watching, thank you. If you're listening, thank you. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so. And we will talk to you soon.